What's happening, y'all? This is Quentin Williams, founder of Project IMU, and welcome to Charlotte Consciousness Conversations. We just got finished with a long weekend of doing some really, really amazing work with City Jam 2016, Bridging the Digital Divide here in Charlotte. I met some really amazing people who are doing really amazing work, you know? And I just wanted to bring this conversation to the air because this conversation was like, I was like, this is too good not to record. I'm in the studio today with Tarek, Theo, and Thomas.
Jonathan.
Tarek, Theo, and Jonathan. Now, if I had known you for like 5 weeks, I would have been like, I feel bad. But honestly,
we just
like,
met today, man.
We
Yeah,
just met
cool.
today. We were having dope
yeah.
conversations. So, Jonathan, I don't think I can forget your name after that embarrassing flub. But welcome to the studio and welcome to Consciousness Conversations.
Thanks for
guys.
having us.
Yeah, it's cool.
Absolutely.
Good to be here.
It's good to have y'all. So we were talking a little bit over some good beer that was provided by somebody who was sponsoring Charlotte City Jam 2016. Mm-hmm. And we were talking a little bit about coming to Charlotte and how it's new and growing and all this excitement that's going on. And then we started talking. Tarek was sharing his story about being from Ferguson and how that really impacted some of his decision in coming to Charlotte. So, Tarek, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, I mean, like, I'm not from Ferguson, but when I was living in Denver, I had a chance to go down to Ferguson. And
so you went specifically to Ferguson for a reason?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
During the situation of the young gentleman that was killed by the police officers following that fallout during the whole situation in Ferguson. But part of that experience was very interesting because I think, like going down there is kind of like a little bit of a shock because I was like, what am I going to do? I had just moved to Denver and it was like 2 weeks later I'm on the road heading down to Ferguson. And really, it was kind of off the cusp. It wasn't really planned. It was kind of like, let's just go. But I think, that experience was very eye-opening because, I mean, you watch a lot of, civil rights movies growing up. You watch a lot of things like Mississippi Burning, which my parents' Roots, which, if you watch Roots, you're like, oh, man. But I think, like, it definitely gave, like, that sense of, like, how far we've come, but then how far we have to go.
Yeah.
And really that experience, is kind of like, wow. You're in St. Louis, which is a really thriving city, but there's really like the little suburbs of the city. Some of them were doing much better than others, so the county was growing, but you really didn't see a lot of people that were in the suburbs actually benefiting from some of those benefits from that growth.
What was Ferguson like for you during the time of the protests, and did it turn into riots while you were there?
It was kind of like some of the riots pretty much had already happened. Like the building was already burned down. Like that had already happened. But I think the next was like the protesting, the peaceful protesting, which was more of like working with, just the going to different mall venues and just getting the word out there. That was pretty interesting to go into different malls and seeing like
the word about what?
Just in terms of like hands up, don't shoot, that whole campaign that aired on CNN with like the folks from Ferguson and from St. Louis going to the malls within the St. Louis County to protest.
What were you telling people when you were at the malls?
It was really like education, like for a lot of people. Some people, were empathizing with a lot of the protesters because some of them may have been a part of the community or may have known or may have observed.
So what I'm trying to get at is for you to share with us what that education looked like, because there's still probably some people who are listening and don't quite understand what why that whole situation exploded the way it did.
I mean, yeah. So Ferguson itself, like the way the way the city and county is structured. Mm-hmm. So the county is structured it was structured in a very interesting way, which was like there's like 90 townships or 90 different suburbs or communities within this county that are all structured and governed a different way. And really, in terms of how resources are distributed within that county and how things are levied, you start to see there's that came out was people in Ferguson were constantly being victimized, to really take resources from that community, whether it's human or financial, and disperse. So that was kind of oppression. Somewhat seemed like oppression was built into a lot of the city's design.
Gotcha. So you're saying that the situation with the young black man being gunned down was just like the tipping point.
It was a symptom of some very deep rooted issues that had enabled environments like this to actually that created a climate where that situation happened.
Okay, so that's something that I definitely did not understand from the media, and I don't know about you guys. What was your experience? Where were you during that time period?
Ferguson, not just Ferguson, but the number of other events that...
Introduce yourself one more time.
Oh, that's Theo Naimi here.
Okay.
Ferguson, a number of other events that happened throughout the course of last year was very interesting for me. Just from a perspective standpoint, most of last year I was traveling overseas. So I visited about 5 different countries over the course of the year. So as most of the events unfolded, I had not only the American perspective growing up in sort of an inner city environment, but I also had the perspective of the foreign community who is trying to process and interpret a lot of this information. And for the most part, I realized that most foreigners have an image of America as this sort of utopian society and aren't aware that underlying a lot of the history of America is a lot of tension. And so to kind of, and especially being African American, being asked about whether some of these issues do actually exist, or is it just, just a symptom of, the media hyping up certain aspects. And I was very surprised to hear that in most other countries, they weren't even aware that these are actual issues.
Okay. And you are from Ghana?
So originally born and raised in Ghana, West Africa, which is interesting as far as the worldview. So, sadly, a lot of Africans see themselves as Africans and not African Americans. Having lived in this country for over 23 years, I have the perspective of being an African American as well as an African. And at different times in my life, I draw on some of those experiences to kind of help me through certain scenarios. For example, being African, from the time I came to this country, my parents had instructed my brother and I that we were going to be successful. We were either going to be lawyers or doctors, and that's the pathway we went down.
And now you're a plastic surgeon.
And now I'm a plastic surgeon. My brother's a neurosurgeon, and some of that is just from this African upbringing that instilled in us a certain set of values.
Yeah, so that's really fascinating to me, and I know that we're talking about Ferguson, but this is interesting because Ferguson is, as you said, Tarek, is a symptom of a greater system of oppression. Now, when we hear Theo talk, he's talking about all these values that are instilled in him from a very young age from his specifically African parents, and it's very different from how many African Americans born in the U.S. are raised, especially in some. My father, who's a retired FBI agent, would actually conjecture that a lot of the reason why that is because of this system of racism that's been institutionalized, that still exists in this country, manifesting itself in the African American family unit in a number of different ways. And some of those are because, our family units are still not essential family units. Oftentimes the father is not in the household, and there's definitely a very obvious distinction between the way that Africans raise their children as African migrants to America and the way that African Americans raise their children. So what's been your perspective as an African migrant who now considers himself an African American, seeing that contrast?
A lot of great points. Being African, the first thing I realized when, I came to this country as an immigrant was that a lot of the images that are projected of African Americans is not necessarily positive. And that has led for a number of decades to Africans specifically not wanting to associate themselves with African Americans, which is very interesting, right? Because in many ways we all look the same, but when you show up and you're of an African descent, one of the things you learn early on is your parents telling you, listen, you are not African American, but by nature of having lived in this country long enough and by the nature of being treated by everyone else as African American, some of those same things that are projected onto the African American society is projected onto you as well.
So what is that rooted in for you?
Very interesting. And understanding some of this for me it required me to go back and look at the history of the African American community post Reconstruction. So, for me, trying to understand where some of those struggles as far as the image of Africans and African Americans comes from required looking at the history. When you look at post-emancipation, a lot of the areas in the South went through an economic downturn, mostly because of the devaluation of cotton overseas. That led to loss of jobs in the South. That led to poor, and when the South economically suffered, African Americans who were newly emancipated suffered even worse. A lot of those then tried to migrate in order to get out of that poverty. That migration out of that poverty led to a number of people moving to cities like New York, D.C., and other centers that became new centers for African Americans. Most of those cities weren't built on a family unit. If you look at Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance, you had a lot of new people moving in to communities that were less family-oriented and more individual. And so that led to a community of people that was less united. And the biggest example, you look at, The Souls of Black Folks by W.B. Du Bois. He talks about the challenges of being able to basically look at somebody who's not your own child and correct them for deviant behavior. In a community where everybody knows each other, it's much easier to do that. If you look at societies where people are living at a more individual level, if you don't know your neighbor, how do you tell your neighbor's child that they need to do the right thing? Right. And so that has led to a number of image issues. And, and not to cite just, post-emancipation and Reconstruction for this, I think to a certain extent the African American community in the 70s and 80s has had some of this to blame on themselves. We've been sold an image of, as black men and women, that through hip-hop, through sports, and a number of other mediums that, we should aspire to either be artists or athletes or rappers, and a lot of the people in our community who are lawyers, doctors, or doing other things, essentially move out of the community. And so what's left behind is a group that has this image. And when my family first came, we lived in the South Bronx, and the only thing we saw was a lot of images that, from a from a family that had newly immigrated, we didn't associate with positive features.
That's really interesting. I mean, I see that myself, and I'm curious, Jonathan, have you seen things from a similar lens as Theo?
I definitely can resonate with, with what my brother's saying about the difference in perspective between Americans, African Americans, or Black Americans, or however we, like to define ourselves. I like to say that I'm Black, and our African brothers. And the reason why I've heard his perspective before is really, from my educational background. I attended the University of Chicago, and it's a great school, private school in Chicago, South Side, and it also has a pretty large international community of students. So that was the first time that I actually attended a school with students from, other countries that were in that formative year, phase where they're talking and expressing themselves and how they really, see and view the world. And it was kind of cool to be in that, space with them, with my perspective of being like a young Black man from the South. And sitting across the table from someone who who maybe their family were immigrant, maybe they had an immigrant family, or maybe they, had just moved into the U.S. And so there was also a pretty large, because of the nature of the school, there were a pretty large African community of students there, along with African American students, and we had these kind of conversations. So I definitely, it resonates with me.
So do you, just using those sort of experiences as a mirror for yourself, how did that cause you to reflect on your own experiences and how other Black people throughout the African diaspora perceived you as an African American?
How would I unpack that? I think that just looking at, how we view ourselves. For me, I know that how I viewed myself now as, a 27-year-old young professional is completely different from how I viewed myself, before I had the chance to gain a perspective or to work across or learn from someone who didn't have that same perspective as me. And it's just kind of that whole, I came out of Charlotte, out of the south of Charlotte. I grew up on the east side, and everyone thought like me. We thought about Black people, about race relations pretty much in the same way. And then, we slowly over time kind of had this difference in, how we viewed ourselves in the world based on experiences.
So the thing that really kind of bothered me about the interaction between African Americans and Africans is that it seemed as though there was a lot of judgment from Africans, and there wasn't as much there wasn't very much any effort from African Americans to connect with Africans. There was always, at least where I grew up, there was a lot of stigmas about Africans, and some of the jokes that we threw around in grade school was, it was a derogatory term to, if somebody did something stupid, we'd be like, shut up, you African booty scratcher. It's like these small things that get lodged into our psyches that are part of the American psyche, but they manifest in very interesting ways as self-hatred within our own communities. And that's something that's really prevented, as you said, Theo, it's prevented us from aspiring to greatness. The way that your parents had instilled this expectation of greatness is not something that's necessarily instilled in African-American families as a whole, because of the reality of the music industry as it pertains to the African-American demographic, as it pertains to the Black demographic, that's promoted in such a way that it actually undermines any sort of expectation of greatness that might otherwise be there. So,
I mean, I agree with everything you said. And as I look at the African-American community from the lens of both an African and now somebody who's been here for 23 years and who's now an African-American as well, to me, there's a significant image problem. This image problem, to me, started in the 60s and 70s, right? I mean, even before then, when the only roles African-Americans could get were, minstrels or as thugs or as things in the community that were not positive. And so the 60s, 70s, if you think about it, the average person based on for entertainment alone isn't reading books. They're watching TV and the media. Mm-hmm. This image problem then further deteriorated if you look at the 80s, 90s with shows like Cops that predominantly, showed different people of different backgrounds committing crimes. You look at the roles that most African Americans get in many movies, and it's usually as thugs or gangsters.
Oh, and as an actor, as somebody who has done a lot of acting, I can definitely testify to that when they are putting out these casting calls, they literally write, and it's very racial, very racist sort of stage direction, which says, young urban, now they use the word urban, but they used to say young Black thug, and people would get coached when they go to those sort of casting calls.
And not to, not to just put the light on the media and how they've kind of portrayed it, even though I think that's where the stem was, then we as a community started internalizing some of these images because that's the only thing that we saw ourselves as on TV.
Right.
Started embodying that. You look at the origins of sort of gangster rap. It was the first time where a lot of these images that in any other community, whether Caucasian, Asian, Jewish community, would have been seen as negative, we started to embrace some of these stereotypes of the black male figure being uneducated, tough, street smart. We started assimilating that and then incorporating that into our own community.
And so part of what you're talking about is also part of the, you're talking about the problem, but I see the problem as being larger than just being the media. And having worked in radio and having worked in music, I saw that firsthand. And part of what's happening is just the natural process of corporations coming and getting involved and putting money behind something that they see is already successful and selling. The issue comes in when the black community, as you had said earlier, the doctors and the people who are successful, the lawyers, they move out of the community, partially because, you want to aspire to having an environment that reflects that success, but also because people within the community also marginalize you. That's a huge aspect of it as well. So when we have that sort of marginalization, there's also this separation between the people who are the doers and the influencers having an influence over the creation of the images that are consumed by our people. So as just explicitly, those images that are created are mostly created by people who are not black.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think as a community, and I'll let you speak after this, Derek, we need to be socially conscious enough to denounce some of these images that are being put out by corporations. Mm-hmm. Even if it's seen as entertainment, most of the people sitting at this table can recognize that some of the lyrics and some of the images is entertainment. But to the person who is a 7-year-old boy growing up in a community where they're not seeing positive examples of role models, they're seeing this as examples of real life. And to them, this is real life. And if they continue to perceive this as reality and basically carry themselves in a way that this is what they're aspiring to be, they're never going to get anywhere. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that faces our community right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to piggyback off what Theo said, and it goes a little bit, further than, the post-Reconstruction. I think if you really was to look at and dive deep into a lot of English literature during the 16th and 17th century, you will start to see this sort of manifestation coming out of the literature and some of the tales that was written back in the 16th and 17th century around black masculinity and around black masculinity being linked to that, which was equivalent to being an animal. And this started way before, so some of this narrative was shaped, through literature. And then the continual effects of that started to boil out into the media, which we see now versus what we read.
So that's a really good point. That's a really profound point for me, because it really points out something that's lying under the surface, which relates to xenophobia. It relates to how we relate to one another who are different, who maybe this might be the first time that we're encountering this sort of person or this sort of culture, and therefore we label it as something that's exotic or something that's subhuman. Mm-hmm. And when I say we, it's because I'm unconsciously identifying with the Western worldview. What I really mean is European culture. So it's important that what's being talked about here when we talk about allies outside of the black community, what we saw at City Jam today, this whole entire weekend with people coming together from various different communities and levels of education and levels of economic affluence, coming together to create something that's going to be a solution and a strategy for bridging the digital divide. What's important for us to recognize is that those people also give the microphone to the people, the stakeholders who are involved or affected by these sort of disenfranchisements. So talking specifically about what you had mentioned, Tarek, what's unique, because European culture has marginalized and created caricatures of all sorts of cultures, not just black cultures. But what is unique about the relationship between the European and the African diaspora is that we've been so
conditioned.
No, I was going to say it's that our relationship has been so insidious. It's been so dehumanized through chattel slavery and through, Jim Crow laws and everything that we are working to heal today, that there's a large amount of guilt surrounding this issue, and this is something that's not really talked about a lot. So when we see those sort of representations in that literature, there's a different dimension that some other cultures can't readily relate to. So when we talk about the media and we talk about Ferguson and people from outside the U.S. or non-black, non-African Americans, they can't quite understand why there's all this frustration centered around the death of this young thug. For me, someone who hasn't been to the protest, but for me as an observer and a reader and an enthusiast of history, I recognize that there's this added dimension there where has been this seething racism beneath the surface that's been internalized by the black community, which almost justifies the actions of the police officers from an outside observer. And I can understand how that might play from someone who's not African American. But there's so many complicated dynamics here that it's really impossible to talk about in one podcast. It's interesting just to try to tie that back to the Ferguson situation, just to, kind of add a close to what is a podcast. But in actuality, there is not a close to this situation. So we've talked about a lot of interesting things. We talked about the relationship of, blacks to the black community and the police officers. We talked about Ferguson specifically in the relationship with municipalities and the way that those various disenfranchised communities have been marginalized. We've talked about the way that African Americans have marginalized Africans and vice versa. So we've run the gambit, and I think that this conversation needs to continue at a later date. But I want to thank all you guys for coming on and jumping on real spontaneously and also participating in City Jam, because City Jam is a event that was started by We Think Next. It's been held here at Advent, where we do our podcasting out of, and it was really interesting, phenomenal, and awesome event. We saw firsthand how a number of different cultures and life experiences and educational levels have come together to really try to find solutions for a issue that's been prevalent in the communities, which is bridging the digital gap. So this comes right on the heels of a Harvard article that was published that's ranked Charlotte as 50 out of 50, the last city in the country really to have upward mobility. So we rank the least probable for upward mobility. So yeah, it was just beautiful to see doers and not talkers, come together and build strategies in a sustainable way. So thanks guys for coming here. It looks like Tarek has one last closing remark. What is that? What's going on?
I think, and I think Theo touched on this, and so did Jonathan, which is that we, as we're going through this evolution process, we have to take back and own our narrative, not just as African Americans, but as people of color. And this is the opportune time to really create a new narrative and transform the narrative that was not created by us, but it was created for us. So this is a really opportune time to really change the narrative.
I really appreciate that comment. And I want to enlarge that comment to all people. We have to own the narrative that we live. One of the things that I saw this weekend is that people of all races, including white people, came together to own their narrative. If you're a white person, this is just my personal opinion. If you're a white person and you consider yourself to be to not see color, well, that's not really helpful to the situation, because color is a reality that most of us in this world, institutionally, corporately, whether we're talking about police and our interactions with people and profiling and prejudice, this is a reality. So if I'm a white person, I'm saying that I really want to heal some of the things that have happened historically that still repel us today, then we have to own up to the reality of the situation. And we have to also own up to our own biases. So I might not have a clear understanding of what people of color are going through. So that means that, they did with We Think Next and City Jam, you have to go out into the community and you have to connect with people and you have to create spaces where these connections can be fostered in ways that aren't awkward and uncomfortable. We had an awesome time here. It was fun. We got some really great ideation and strategy together. And part of the reason for that was because the space was already primed. So owning the narrative is something that is super, super important for African Americans and Africans, because that's been taken away from us. But it's also important for, if any other people outside of those communities want to get involved, that it's a collaboration. It's I don't know sort of thing, and coming to the table to explore and discover. So thank you guys again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really, really interesting conversation. And I look forward to having you guys back on the show.
Great. Love
Thanks
it.
so much.
Awesome.
Thanks, listeners, for tuning in. Take care.